The vanishing town. Nobody is allowed to talk about. There is a town on official government maps that the government itself insists does not exist. Not a ghost town, not a ruin, a functioning community with roads, buildings, and hundreds of residents that was erased from public records so completely that for decades asking about it in the wrong place could get you detained. Tonight, we're going inside Pitcher, Oklahoma, a town the federal government quietly condemned, forcibly evacuated, and then did everything in its power to make the world forget. And the deeper you dig into what actually happened here, the more you start to wonder whether what they told the public was even close to the truth. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to question what else is sitting on a map right now that nobody is supposed to notice. Pitcher, Oklahoma was once the beating heart of the American dream. In the early 1900s, it became the most productive lead and zinc mining district in the entire world. During both world wars, the ore pulled from beneath this small corner of the Midwest supplied roughly half of all the metal used in American bullets and artillery. Half. The town was not just important, it was essential. At its peak, over 14,000 people called Pitcher home. There were schools, churches, diners, a main street that hummed with life. The government knew exactly where Pitcher was. They funded it. They celebrated it. And then, very quietly, they decided it needed to disappear. By the 1980s, what lay beneath Pitcher had become a catastrophe decades in the making. Over a century of industrial mining had left more than 300 million tons of toxic mining waste, called chat, piled across the landscape in massive grey mountains that locals simply called chat piles. Children played on them, families lived beside them, and the entire time lead dust was saturating the soil, the water, and the air. Studies conducted in the 1990s revealed something devastating. More than a third of the children living in Pitcher had blood lead levels so elevated they met the clinical threshold for lead poisoning. These weren't trace amounts, these were numbers associated with permanent neurological damage, reduced IQ, behavioral disorders, developmental delays that would follow those children for the rest of their lives. The government had known. For years they had known. And yet families were not warned, not evacuated, not compensated. They were left there. Here is where the story stops being a tragedy and starts becoming something else entirely. When federal agencies finally moved to classify Pitcher as a Superfund site, one of the most contaminated locations in the United States, the process was not handled with the transparency you might expect. Documents released through Freedom of Information requests reveal a sustained pattern of delayed disclosure. Internal memos from the Environmental Protection Agency show that officials were actively aware of dangerous contamination levels years, in some cases over a decade, before any public announcement was made. Why the delay? One internal memo, dated 1981, references concerns about liability exposure and the economic impact of premature disclosure on regional mining interests. Let that sit for a moment. The concern was not the children drinking the water. The concern was liability. What investigators found next shocked everyone. Geological surveys conducted in the early 2000s revealed that the ground beneath Pitcher had been so extensively hollowed out by mining tunnels that vast sections of the town were essentially suspended over empty space. Some subsurface caverns stretched for acres. The risk of catastrophic ground collapse was not theoretical, it was imminent, and according to the surveys, it had been imminent for some time. The town was not just poisoned, it was physically sinking, yet residents were still living there, still being told things were manageable. If you're finding this as unsettling as I am, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe, because what comes next is where this story takes a turn most people never hear about. Former Paicha residents have given accounts that paint a portrait of deliberate institutional neglect that borders on the criminal. One long-time resident who grew up in Paicha and whose family had lived there for 3 generations described being visited by federal environmental agents in the early 1990s. They took soil samples from her backyard. They tested her well water. They told her everything was fine. 2 years later, her youngest son was diagnosed with lead poisoning. When she went back to request the original test results, she was told the records could not be located. She was not alone. Dozens of families have reported similar experiences. Tests conducted, assurances given, records subsequently unavailable. The data that did survive tells a stark story. The Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry confirmed that Paicha's contamination ranked among the worst residential lead exposure events in American history. The chat piles, some over 200 feet tall, continued to leach toxins into the local watershed for decades after the mining companies had long since packed up and left. Those companies, incidentally, faced minimal financial consequences. The cleanup costs were absorbed almost entirely by federal taxpayers. In 2006, the federal government formally recommended a voluntary buyout program. Residents were offered money to leave. By 2009, the population had dropped from several thousand to fewer than 24 people. The last official residents departed shortly after. Paicha was then formally disincorporated. It ceased to exist as a municipality, a town of 14,000 people, gone, quietly, efficiently, with very little national attention. So what do we make of all this? There are 3 serious interpretations, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first is systemic negligence. The simplest reading is that this was a catastrophic failure of regulatory oversight driven by political and economic priorities. Mining was powerful. The companies had lobbying muscle. The government dragged its feet, people were harmed, and the town eventually became impossible to sustain. Tragic, but not conspiratorial. The second theory points to deliberate suppression. The timeline of those internal EPA memos is difficult to explain away as mere bureaucratic slowness. If officials were aware of the danger in 1981 and public warnings didn't come until the mid-1990s, that gap represents a decision. Someone decided that disclosure was too costly. That is not negligence. That is a choice. The third theory is the one that Paicha's former residents talk about most, that the contamination was always known, that the community was considered expendable, and that the disincorporation and erasure of Paicha from civic life was not the result of the disaster. It was the intended conclusion to it. Remove the community, remove the liability, remove the witnesses. Here is what most people never hear. A tornado struck what remained of Paicha in May 2008. While residents were still living there, 8 people died. The storm destroyed much of the remaining infrastructure, and within months the buyout program accelerated dramatically. Some former residents believe the tornado was, in a grim and terrible way, convenient. It provided a natural explanation for the town's final disappearance that had nothing to do with decades of poisoning and institutional failure. The story became about a storm, not about the children, not about the memos, not about the 30-year gap between what was known and what was said. Picha is still on the map, technically, but there is no mayor, no council, no government, no services. It exists as a geographical coordinate attached to nothing, a name without a community. And the people who once lived there, many of them still dealing with the health consequences of their exposure, largely live in silence that was never really their choice. Picha, Oklahoma, is one of the most documented examples of a community being systematically failed, silenced, and ultimately erased, and most people have never heard of it. And that might be the most disturbing part of all. Thank you for watching. I want to know what you think. Is what happened in Picha negligence, or does the timeline of those internal memos point to something more deliberate? Leave your answer in the comments below, because that conversation matters. If this video made you think, please like it and subscribe. There are more stories like this one, communities, documents and events that the official record treats as footnotes. We're going to keep pulling at those threads. I'll see you in the next one.